Ahí está iniciando la transmisión.
Ok. Así que listo, avísame, por favor.
Sí, ya pueden. Está disponible.
Ok. Buenos días a todos. Yo soy José Luis Carvalho, presidente de GLENIF. Tenemos esta audiencia hoy para un outreach con el equipo de IASB del proyecto de pequeñas y medianas empresas. Vamos a tener una sesión para que tengamos también la oportunidad de llevar nuestros comentarios a este equipo. La sesión será conducida totalmente en inglés, pero si tú tienes cuestiones, me puede poner en el chat que podemos traducirla para el equipo de la misma manera, ¿ok? Entonces, señoras y señores, yo voy a cambiar para el inglés para que podamos iniciar nuestra sesión. Hi, good morning all. I am José Luis Carvalho, the president of GLASS. And we welcome the team of IASB for this outreach on the project on small and medium entities. So I welcome Tadeu Cendon, who is the board member, who will be conducting the outreach along with the team that is in charge of this project. So welcome you all, and Tadeu, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, José. Good morning and good afternoon, very morning for some, I know. Thank you very much for having us today for this outreach. It's quite important for us to hear, especially from Latin America, that in the first phase, when we have the request for information, we received a lot of comment letters from the region, and we really appreciate that. I think that's a quite important region for us, as many of the jurisdictions apply IFRS for SME, not only for few, but for many entities. Therefore, thank you very much, and we are very welcome comments for this exposure draft as well. Together with me, I have Michelle Sanson, Michelle Fischer, and Tinico Denhere. They three are from our IFRS for SMEs project team. And without more delays, I'll pass this to Michelle that will provide us some backgrounds and start with the presentation. Thank you very much again for all your investment in helping us to bring the best for this review. Thank you very much. Michelle, floor is yours. You are on mute.
So
not
thank
anymore.
you not anymore. So thank you very much for providing us the opportunity to chat through the proposals in the exposure draft this afternoon. Would it be helpful if I shared my screen, or do we just want to work through the slides?
I think sharing the screen is okay. Michelle, if you want, I don't know whether someone else wants to share the slide, or you sharing the slide is good. It's fine for you.
Okay, I'll share the slides and then.
Yeah.
You are free to go, Michelle. Go ahead.
Right, hopefully you should be able to see the slides now.
Yes, we can.
So I'll go through a bit of background on the proposals and how the board got to the proposals, and I'll run through the main proposals in the exposure draft, and I'll talk about some topics the board is asking for views on, even though they're not proposals in the exposure draft, before just quickly explaining what our next steps will be. So looking at the background, the IFRS for SMEs, as you know, was initially published in 2009. There was a second edition in 2015, which followed the first comprehensive review. Now, in that review, the board made few amendments to the standard because the standard was essentially quite new at that time. We started the second comprehensive review in 2019, and in January 2020 published a request for information. We have now published the exposure draft that builds on the feedback that we had from that request for information. So the board heard when it was developing the original standard that it would be better for SMEs not to have constant updates of the standard, but to have periodic reviews. So not less than 2 years from the date which the previous standard becomes effective, the board starts its next comprehensive review. So when we look at what we're trying to do, we're trying to work out, should we update the standard for things that have happened in full IFRS? So the board starts with the request for information, and in that request for information, importantly, we set out the framework that we would use for deciding whether to update the standard. And then using that framework, we've published the exposure draft. So the board had two big questions when it started the project in 2019. What should be the scope of the review and how should it conduct the review? And the scope question arose because in the first review, as I said, the board had not made that many amendments. And consequently, there were a number of standards like IFRS 13, IFRS 3, that the board had considered, but decided to defer alignment with in the first review. And then there were a whole load of new standards between the first review and the second review. So you can see from this slide, the board decided to review everything, get themselves back up to speed. So that has made this review a very broad scope review. Now, when we were discussing with the board the scope of the review, it was quite clear that board members had differing views about how much the standard should remain based on IFRS standards. And to be honest, some board members said, no, we shouldn't align it at all. The standard's there, it works. We should only update it if somebody's told us there's a problem. So for instance, people have told us there's a problem with issued financial guarantee contracts. Other board members were at the opposite end of the goalposts, and they were saying, actually, we should just update it for everything. It's the IFRS for SMEs. It should be fully aligned. Now, we needed a way as staff to structure our discussions with the board, and we came up with something called the alignment principles. And what they do is they make the board have a structured framework for thinking about whether to amend this standard. So they start by saying, is this change in an IFRS standard relevant to SMEs? Would it change the decisions of users of SME financial statements? And if the board finds enough evidence to say, yes, it is relevant, then it looks at the resources that are available to SMEs, recognizing that SMEs generally have less resources than publicly accountable entities. So if we look for ways for simplifying the standard, and some of the simplifications we're proposing this time are around the acquisition method in IFRS 3, how to apply IFRS 15. Having looked at simplifications, the board stands back and says, do we still get a faithful representation? So does the outcome reflect the economics of the transaction? Now, generally, people supported that approach to the board's thinking when considering whether to update the SME standard. There was a little bit of feedback about, well, you haven't really considered cost and benefit. I don't think we hadn't not considered cost and benefit, because relevance would say we'd only make a change if there would be a benefit to users, and simplification would look at the cost of that benefit. But we did say we would think about cost and benefits further. So I'll move on to the main proposals in the exposure draft, because I think pretty much the board has received the feedback on that framework and has applied that framework to the proposals that we've got in the exposure draft. So the exposure draft is written in a number of ways. Some sections, and that is section 2 and section 23, are completely new sections because they are aligning with new standards, and we felt that they would be better as completely new sections. The remainder of the sections are shown in marked up text, but for example, some sections are quite heavily marked up, particularly business combinations. So we've made available a clean version on our website. So the first point the board needed to look at was the conceptual framework that had been issued in 2018. Now, the IFRS for SMEs was based on the board's original framework, and there seemed no doubt that if we were going to continue to have an IFRS for SMEs, it needed to be based on the new framework. We asked in the request for information, do you think we should update? And the general view was yes. So there's a new section 2 that includes some new concepts around measurement presentation. It includes the updated definitions and recognition criteria for assets and liabilities, provides a bit of clarification about prudence and stewardship. Now, one of the things we had feedback on was, section 2 of the SME standard is equivalent to any other section in the standard. So it has a different status from the conceptual framework in full IFRS standards, because in full IFRS standards, the framework is there for the board to use when it's developing its standards, most predominantly. So what we decided to do was to add an overriding principle to say, well, look, if there's a more specific requirement in another section of the standard, then that takes precedence. So that is the requirement you follow rather than what's in section 2. And this is particularly important around some of the definitions of assets and liabilities. Then the other point just to note is that we have retained the concept of undue cost or effort. We always get feedback on the concept of undue cost or effort because it is sometimes difficult for an auditor to assess, has there been undue cost or effort? But overall, the board decided that this is a useful tool for them to have when they are developing the IFRS for SME standard. So what do we think that this new section will do? We think for SMEs, it will help them when they are in the circumstance that they need to develop an accounting policy because the standard doesn't have a policy. The section is a little bit more detailed, but it is quite easily structured. And retaining the undue cost or effort, as I said, does help SMEs. We think in terms of users, this will help with understanding of information because they'll have a structure if the accounting policy has been developed looking at section 2. Now, one of the questions that we had when we were updating section 2 was section 2 includes the new definition of assets and liabilities, whereas section 18, which is intangibles, and section 21, which deals with provisions and contingent liabilities, relied on the previous definition. In full IFRS standards, the board didn't have quite the same challenge because those standards included the definition, whereas the SME standard is a more comprehensive and complete product. So what we've had to do is to bring back those definitions of the old definition of the asset and the old definition of a liability into those sections. And one of the questions that we're asking is, do you agree with what we've done here? It is consistent with what's been done in full IFRS, but we just want to make sure people are happy with that approach. So today, would you like me to stop now and take any questions?
I think yes. Luis, if you can just go around and see whether anyone would like to raise any issue in relation to this part of the presentation.
Right, Tadeu. Well, first of all, we have to say that we have a specific working group that is analyzing the project. And we are holding several meetings and in a time frame that was planned, and we hope that we can complete this task by the due date in order to have our common letter as planned. But I can, Michelle, anticipate some some comments and some views that it's preliminary views. I might say that the task force is analyzing and discussing it, and afterwards we have to discuss in the board and the GLASS board in order to confirm the views that came up from this team. Initially, we welcome this alignment. We think it is a huge progress, and when compared to the current standard, and but we have some concern when we talk about having a kind of a duality when we have two definition of assets and liabilities. And of course, I think it's the ideal situation that we could have only one definition, but we cannot escape from this comment. And we support that IASB consider this view in order to have a complete alignment in terms of concepts in the future. I don't know if it's feasible now, no, because it's quite evident that it's there for a purpose, and because of many reasons that we don't know exactly which ones are, but we would like to understand it.
Yeah.
And
José Luis, if I may jump here, and Michelle, please feel free to complement or correct me if I say something wrong. The point is that when we look at the IFRS standards, the framework is a guidance for issuing the standards, but we might have some of the items in the IFRS standards that not necessarily are full aligned with the framework for many reasons, including the time when you issue the framework. It is the case, for example, that especially for these two that Michelle referred to, we haven't changed this in the IFRS standard yet. And then if we align the definition in these two sections with the framework, it will be disaligned with the IFRS standard until we align the IFRS standard with the framework.
The full IFRS standard. No?
Yeah, exactly. Because it sounds something easy, but sometimes it is not. You might have some unintended consequence. You may need to adjust here and there. And then the main reason for keeping this supposed disalignment with the framework is because to keep it aligned with the IFRS standards. And then that's the main point here. I don't know, Michelle, if I...
Yeah, one of the things we try not to do when we develop the IFRS for SMEs is what we call jump ahead of full IFRS. And if we had updated, used the new definitions, we would have been jumping ahead of full IFRS. I mean, that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't, because that's why we asked the question, because what we were doing was sort of saying, we don't think there's any problems if we aligned the definitions, but we don't know. So the fear of unintended consequences meant that we stayed with the old definitions. So that's how we did it. But that it's also the reason that the question is in the invitation to comment, because it was a difficult judgment call.
Right. Before I jump to another consideration, I don't know if someone else here wanna pose a question.
It seems that Bill has his hands up.
Yes, just a general comment.
Right.
Here in Mexico, we have always been challenged by the concept or the fact that there can be inconsistencies between individual standards and the conceptual framework. In Mexico, we think of the conceptual framework as the accounting constitution and the individual standards as the laws, and they cannot be in conflict. I do recognize, Michelle, that there are more fingers on my two hands than there are differences or evident inconsistencies. There's not that many, but there are. And I think we sort of, quote, tolerate that from the concept that the framework for full IFRS is a guideline, as was explained by Tadeu, and the standards are another thing. But when you put that paragraph that you did in section 2 in the IFRS for SMEs, that's challenging to me because you have inconsistency within one standard. It is a standard, and you say paragraph 2, section 2 says this is what it is, and section 20 says this is what it is. So consistencies within the same document highlights our concern and increases our concern. So, you know, I think all of this could be fixed by making the conceptual framework aligned and normative. And I know, and I've heard the arguments why that's not done. I will accept it, and I don't want to open that can of worms again. That's not the point. But I think in this, that paragraph that you added makes sense, and it's consistent with IFRS. And I understand not getting ahead of yourself with the IFRS for SMEs. But I think all that could be fixed. But that's just a comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think it's a comment that I would reject either. I mean, it's different, isn't it? Because certainly the background I came from, the conceptual framework, had probably had more emphasis than it does in IFRS, where it's sort of a guideline for the board.
Yeah.
And when you have those conflicts, it's quite uncomfortable. Fortunately, we're not proposing some of the IFRIC interpretations that definitely conflict, so we're not bringing those into the standard. So I think what we're doing is trying to avoid unintended consequences rather than having a conflict. But it would be good if I think that's why we're sort of saying, do you think there are any unintended consequences?
Sure.
But yeah, I accept the point completely.
Thank you.
Okay, well, before returning to you, Michelle, I have a small minimum comment here in terms of definition. I don't know if it's the right place to comment it. It's on the paragraph 214. We would appreciate having, let's say, a better definition or explanation of economical phenomenon or economical effects when in the preparation of financial statements. So the team came up with this view because in our region, this expression may include aspects that have no direct incidence in the financial information of an entity, which may have some kind of misinterpretation of what is economical phenomenon. When we talk about termination of an entity, of employees, or a reduction in economic activity. So it's more a kind of, why not to have a better explanation of this term, because it embodies many,
yeah,
right?
And to be entirely honest, when I drafted that, I actually did drafting on the section of the conceptual framework, whereas some of the other team did it. It was difficult to get the balance because I was trying as hard as possible to keep the section 2 short. So it may be that I've missed some words that are actually quite useful. So we can, if that's a comment in the comment letter, we can go back and look at that and see if there's something we should bring in.
Okay, we will do that. Appreciate your.
Yeah, José Luis, just one question. You talked about paragraph 214.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Just to be sure here. Thank you.
All right. I think it is all we have at the moment. If you don't mind, you can continue, Michelle.
I think Adriana has her hand.
Adriana, I cannot see the hand. Right.
No, if you don't mind, I just want to add one comment that is very important. I've heard a lot of comments related to undue cost effort. I know that it's very, very important to maintain it for make this the standard simple, and of course that's the main reason of having this standard. But a lot of comments that I've heard in general from the preparers of the financial statements, if it's possible to clarify more about this undue cost effort. Because many times they say, "Oh, that's okay. I cannot do this because I have a lot of costs to, for example, having a fair value number related to what else." I know that it's a principle, and it's very hard to add something else related to this. But sometimes they say, "Can we have some examples or a guidance or things like that?" It's a challenge, I know, but that's the comments that I've heard from the preparers. Thank you very much.
Adriana, if I may add some other words here, I think it could be a kind of, let's say, an explanation or a statement that the primacy on the compliance of the qualitative characteristics of the fundamentals should be considered when you measure the undue cost and effort. So it should prevail the qualitative characteristics of the financial statements. So we know that, of course, but perhaps a kind of a strong statement about it in order to make it clear that we
kind of stress it out, maybe.
Yeah.
Something like this.
Highlight it. Yeah.
Sorry, as I said, we do get feedback on the application of undue cost or effort. I can't remember, and Michelle, who's on the call, she might remember better than me how much guidance we've got in the modules on undue cost or effort, but we can have a look and see if there is anything further we can do to help.
Just to clarify,
okay.
Michelle, the modules you referred to is the training modules that we have, the educational one that we have in our website. Okay, just to clarify, because this wasn't translated into Spanish or Portuguese, not sure whether everybody is familiar with, despite it's a very good material that we have the aim to update that after the review, but it's just to let everybody knows that we have this material available in our website without the need for a subscription.
Yeah, I would recommend, I mean, I appreciate they're not in Spanish, but the modules are, they do have a wealth of information in them, so they might have something that is helpful.
Yeah, Michelle, if you allow me as well, another thing that is important to mention, the fact that we have added the undue cost effort or retained it in the framework, people should be aware that you can't use in all standards. It has to be in the standard. It's just a conceptual principle, let's say.
Yeah, you can only use it where the board say you can use it. So it isn't a undue cost or effort that's spread throughout the standard. There are specific circumstances where we say one of them is contingent consideration in IFRS 3, where we say if there's undue cost or effort of measuring at fair value, you can put in the most likely amount. So it's only in the circumstances the board says you can use this concept. So it's not freely available.
Yeah, it has to be in the section, the specific section.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. With that, I think that we can go ahead, Michelle. Can we use that? Yeah.
Yes, at the moment, yes.
So we'll move on to financial instruments. So IFRS 9, as soon as you say it, people start running in the opposite direction. But what I can say is I think where we ended up, probably due to Michelle's hard work, is in a very balanced place. So I'll run through what we're proposing. First of all, we're proposing that we would remove the option in to apply IAS 39. So when the board developed the standard, there was they were undertaking their project on financial instruments, and therefore it was felt that we should have an option to use big gap. But it was the only option in the whole of IFRS to revert to big in the whole of the IFRS for SMEs to revert to big gap. So now IFRS is complete. The board has gone through its alignment principles. We're proposing to take away that option. And furthermore, I think the subsidiaries project will be online, so that will reduce the use of that option, because what we were hearing was it was mainly subsidiaries that were using that option. So what are we doing? If I look at each of the areas of IFRS 9, I can convince myself that we've come up with some very balanced proposals. So if you look at classification and measurement, the SME standard basically has some examples, and it says, use these examples to help you classify your financial instrument. We heard that sometimes the financial instruments didn't fit well with the examples. So what we're putting in is a principle, but you only have to apply the principle if you get through the list of examples and you're not sure what to do. And the principle is based on contractual cash flows. So we think that that's really just making the standard easier to apply. We are proposing some new requirements for issued financial guarantee contracts, but that is responding to calls for us to simplify the current requirements. The current requirements are that issued financial guarantee contracts are measured at fair value. However, we've got feedback from our SME implementation group that they would prefer if we looked at an alternative. Now, I think I have included the proposals in this slide deck here. So we'll bring in the definition from full IFRS. Generally, we consulted on that in the RFI, and people supported it. People were less supportive about using the IFRS 9 measurement requirements. So we've tried to simplify them to say, measure at the transaction price rather than at fair value, and then thereafter at the higher of the provision for expected credit losses, or the amount that's initially recognised and amortised on a straight line basis. Now, we've heard some feedback on that, but well, we'll have to see what people say. And then the next area is expected credit losses. Now, let me start by saying we are not proposing, and we never proposed, the SME standard should have the general model for expected credit losses. In the request for information, we said, do you think we should introduce the simplified model, which is a lifetime expected credit loss model? And people said, well, we don't really think so. We think that's a little bit complicated, so we're not really sure about it. And furthermore, most SMEs have got trade receivables and contractual assets. And really, they're already using forward-looking models or a matrix to calculate their provisions. So we don't think introducing the simplified model would really be of benefit. The board were a little bit concerned that if we just left the incurred loss model for those SMEs that had something else other than a trade receivable or a contractual asset, they wouldn't be recognising losses early enough. So we've ended up with proposing keeping the incurred loss model for trade receivables and contract assets, but thereafter proposing an expected credit loss model. And I kind of refer to this expected credit loss model as the simplified expected credit loss model, because we tried really hard, or Michelle tried really hard, to come up with something that would be simple to apply given the resources that are available to SMEs. So we say an unbiased and probability weighted amount for evaluating alternative outcomes, an amount that represents the time value of money and is based on reasonable and supportable information that's available. I guess we are hearing some feedback upon that expected credit loss model. I do like to stress to people that I don't think it's it's not an IFRS 9 model, but something that would have an expected loss outcome. So So that's all we're doing. We're not doing anything else. The board decided not to touch the hedge accounting requirements. It decided not to introduce the fair value OCI option. That is all we are doing. So we think what we're proposing should help SMEs that issue financial guarantee contracts, because we're simplifying it. We're not changing the requirements of those SMEs that have generally just got trade receivables and contractual assets. We do think that by removing the option to 39, that would be more effective and improve comparability. And we do think that you get better information for those financial assets that are measured using an expected credit loss model. So let me stop there, because we have two questions. One is, what are your views on introducing the expected credit loss model for only some financial assets? And we're also asking if you're aware of SMEs that are issuing financial guarantee contracts. So let me stop share.
Well, thank you, Michelle. For the first question, I can start by saying that the working group discussed this point preliminarily, and we have a view that, of course, it would be preferable that we could use the expected loss model, and if it's not applied as an only option, perhaps it could be used as a best practice for an SME. If it could be an option for the SME to apply the expected credit loss model, and that's basically an initial discussion on that. I don't know if someone else want to complement.
Carlos Valle, de Peru, has his.
Carlos, go ahead. Hi, Carlos.
Thank you. Hi, Jose Luis. Hi, Tadeu. Thank you very much. We think applying an expected credit loss model could be very complex to SMI, especially for forward-looking. No, did you really analyze this point on the light of undue cost of E4? Thank you.
I think Michelle, Carlos was talking about not the trade receivables, for the other assets that the ECL is still applicable, whether
Yes.
and you just think about the ECL, how it works, what he's saying, that can we maybe think about the cost and effort for this one?
Well, I'm going to let Michelle correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we did spend a lot of time, and that's why what we're proposing is a simplified model. We tried really hard to make sure what we would be proposing wouldn't be burdensome on those entities that have got financial assets that are not trade receivables or contractual assets.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. Luis, I think Adriana has her hand on.
Yeah. Can I?
Okay, Adriana, go ahead.
It's just one question. For example, I want to give you an example related to what Jose said. We have a lot of agricultural companies here, and it's very common in Latin America, I would say. And when you have when you have an option of incurred loss model and credit loss model, when it's talking about agricultural accounts receivable, for example, which it can be for a long term, maybe you can have a recognition of a credit loss in not tempestive. You know what I mean? It can be later. The credit loss can be recognized late instead of on the right and proper time, because you are applying credit laws instead of the other method. I don't know if I was clear.
Adriana, if I can add I think it's because the economic cycle is longer than the usual commercial.
Yeah.
So it will take too much to. It will be too late to recognize the losses in this sector if we adopted the incurred laws.
Adriana,
I think Tadeu has a good experience in this area too. Here,
no, it's just to clarify. Adriana, are you talking about the trade receivables?
Trade receivables.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, and then in this case, the trade receivables, you would keep the incurred model. I think that
the expected.
No, incurred model. If it is trade receivables, is incurred model. I mean, it's the old one, the old-fashioned one.
Yeah.
The old one. What is good behind the incurred? Because sometimes people, to be very honest, depending on the company, you move from one to another, and the numbers will not change. We had this discussion in the board. I mean, that because it's so subtle, and then, but actually, when you are applying the expected credit loss, it is expected, for example, for any single trade receivable, you should have a kind of loss expected, even if it's a tiny one, but should be there. But in terms of the trade receivable for the agriculture business, I mean, it's a trade receivables, and if you apply the incurred model, you may probably find some milestones information that might allow you to recognize the loss, but it should stick to the incurred loss. Otherwise, we would have some inconsistency with what we are proposing here. Michelle, I saw that you have your hands on.
Yeah, because I think Adriana raises a fair point, because when we were looking at trade receivables, I don't think we were thinking that the SME would have short-term trade receivables, so sort of credit terms that were 90 to 120 days at the most. But if the agricultural credit terms are much longer, then it does question whether we should say, well, if you want to opt into an expected credit model, expected credit loss model, you could do, but we'd have to put disclosures in around it.
That's it, Michelle. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. In respect to the second question, we are not aware of these transactions for SME at the moment, and but perhaps in the due course, if we have any hindsight on that, we would appreciate having opportunity to advise you, but not at the moment. I'm not aware of. I don't know if other member here would like to comment something.
One, Michelle, correct me if I were in the other side, based on my experience in Latin America. I think that the most common financial guarantee contract for SMEs, at least in my experience, are with related parties. It's not uncommon when we do that. And then maybe within a consolidated group, it might not make a difference. But when you think about associate companies or even standalone financial statements, it might be an issue. I mean, that, and sometimes people don't realize, but they have issued a financial guarantee contract. That's the point. At least from top of my mind here, what I would remember, that wasn't so uncommon transaction in Latin America.
Tadeu, my proposal is to articulate this question again in the group, and if we have any finding, we will bring it to you. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Michelle, back to you.
Okay, so I will move on. So the next section we are going to talk about is fair value measurement. So for fair value measurement, at the moment, there is guidance in the standard on fair value measurement, but it's in individual sections, or the bulk of it is in the financial instruments section. In the RFI, we said to people, would it be useful if actually we took all the guidance and put it in a new chapter? And should we update the guidance so that it is aligned with IFRS 13? The general view was, yeah, we should it would be better to have the guidance in one chapter. The team spent quite a lot of time discussing where we were going to put it. In the end, we've combined the two financial instruments chapters and brought in a new chapter on fair value. We generally heard in response to the RFI that key definitions between IFRS for SMEs and IFRS should be aligned. So we've updated the definition of fair value. We've brought in more guidance for when entities are measuring assets at fair value, a little bit more around the hierarchy and a bit more framework. And we've also brought in some examples. So it is true to say that that section has grown a little bit, but I hope that what we hear is for management is quite often difficult to apply judgment. So it's a kind of balance in that we've brought in more guidance to help when you're measuring fair value, which tends to be one of the more judgmental areas. And we've also proposed some improvements to the disclosure requirements. We're not changing when fair value is permitted or required. We are bringing in one or two new areas to be measured at fair value, but fair value is already in the standard. We're not changing that in itself. And we do think for preparers that the guidance will be clearer and more accessible. We think for users, they'll get some improved disclosures, and with better application of measuring fair value, they should get improved comparability. For business combinations, IFRS 3. Now, the SME standard has business combination requirements in it, in that it has, it's based on IFRS 3 2004. What we were originally going to do was update to IFRS 3 2008, but the board said, actually, as part of the post-implementation review of IFRS 3, we clarified the definition of a business to make it easier to apply. Therefore, given that we've already clarified that definition for full IFRS users, we should make that clarification available for SMEs as well. Then we are now going to update to require the acquisition method that's in IFRS 3 2008, but actually we've taken all the amendments to IFRS 3, and so the SME standard will now be consistent with the current version of IFRS 3. So it will include the new definition of assets and liabilities, so it's consistent with section 2, as Blaise was commenting. In terms of the acquisition method, we are introducing the board's proposing requirements for step acquisitions. This has been a bit of a tricky one because we asked in the RFI, should we do this? And some people said no, but our SME implementation group thought that we should do it, if I've got that the right way round. So this is an area we decided to put the proposals in the exposure draft and see what people say. We are proposing that contingent considerations should be valued at fair value. We did look at ways to simplify the acquisition method, and there were some interesting ways that we did that. We didn't change the recognition criteria for intangible assets. We didn't put in discussion about reacquired rights. Now, the reason that we could do some of that was because in the SME standard, goodwill is amortized as opposed to only being impaired. There's not such a level of tension between the definition of an intangible asset and the definition of goodwill, because an intangible asset that's subsumed within goodwill will also be amortized. So we were able to make some of those simplifications. One of the things that we have simplified is we're not introducing the option to measure non-controlling interests at fair value. We've had differing views on that. Some people say, well, it's not fair that full IFRS has got an option that SMEs haven't got available to them. Other people say, well, that option isn't used very much. So that's one of the questions that we do ask in the invitation to comment. So quite a lot of changes to section 19, as I said. There's a clean version on our website. We think for SMEs, they'll get the benefit of the definition of a business, so that should make section 19, deciding when to apply it, easier. And we do think as well, if they have got step acquisitions, having requirements there will be easier for them. We're just not sure if we'd pass the relevance alignment principle. For users, there'll be more consistent information, especially around step acquisitions. And because we're requiring the acquisition method, where the cost of the acquisition would be recognised in profit and loss and the consideration would be measured at fair value, we do think that there'll be a better ability to look at the investment that has been assessed, the investment in the business combination and the performance of it. So two areas that we're asking for feedback on are, have we passed the relevance tests for acquisition, for step acquisitions? And what do you think about not including the option? So let me just stop there and see what people have to say.
Well, as these questions, Michelle, our initial comment is that we welcome this alignment with IFRS 3. It will be a great progress for accounting for SMEs. And our question is, why not aligning it entirely? And when we talk about it, we talk about fair valuing of non-controlling interest, as well, not including the existing contracts and at the time that you prepare the accounting for the acquisition. So in principle, we have those two considerations. We are developing the discussions, but by the end, I think it will be our preference and that we could have a kind of, let's say, for example, if existing contracts for an SE, it might be a nightmare if it's relevant, considering the structure, financial structure they are. So perhaps the financial statement would benefit of having a recognition of those effects instead of not closing the eyes for this important economic transaction. It can be the case. And fair valuing of NCI might be we have good reasons for saying that accounting for fair value would be the cost benefit of doing it is not beneficial. But I sincerely, if it's the reasoning, perhaps it will be considered on a case-by-case basis, but it's a relevant information for the user or users. So in principle, we have those two considerations. I don't know if someone else here would like to pose additional comments. It's open.
I can't see any hands.
Right. I cannot see all the hands here, Tadeu. I don't know. My screen is right. It's cut in the top. Okay, but Tadeu, this is we are progressing with the discussions in the group, and but I think those initial reactions were very clear for us in the group.
Okay, thank you, Michelle.
Okay, and let's move on then to the consolidation package. So for the consolidation package, this was IFRS 10 and IFRS 11. In the request for information, we did ask for views on updating the definition of control. So the SME standard at the moment has two ways of assessing whether an entity controls another entity or is part of the group. One is the special purpose requirements, and the other one is control. IFRS 10 introduced a single model. At the time that we were developing the proposals for the exposure draft, we were also undertaking the post-implementation review of IFRS 10, 11 and 12. Now, it's fair to say that we did get feedback on IFRS 10 that applying the control model can be complex, but where we got feedback that it was complex was where you had difficult structures. But where there are quite simple structures, then the control model is not so difficult to apply. So generally, we felt it would be good to introduce the definition of control and have the single basis for consolidation. And we're proposing some of the guidance about how to apply the definition. But in doing so, we also decided to retain the rebuttable presumption. So the SME standard has a simplification that says, look, if you own more than 50% or the majority of the voting rights of the entity, you have control, but you can rebut that in certain circumstances. So we decided that we would keep that as well. So I think overall, bringing in the definition of control updates the standard, brings in a single model, and doesn't make it more complex to apply unless you've got a very complex structure. When, you know, there again, that's if you've got yourself into a complex structure, then you've got some complex accounting to do. We did need to add some new requirements into section 10 to align it with the acquisition model. So we've got a new requirement for the partial disposal. So you would measure your retained interest at fair value. And then moving on to IFRS 10, IFRS 11 rather, sorry. Because we'd updated the definition of control, I felt I needed to persuade the board a bit on this, that they should update the definition of joint control. Eventually they agreed, yes, they should update the definition of joint control, but they didn't want to update the classification. So IFRS 11 has two types of joint arrangements, joint ventures and joint operations. The SME standards has three types. It has jointly controlled entity, jointly controlled assets, and joint ventures. The classifications in the SME standard are a little bit more based on the legal structure of the entity, so it makes classification a little bit simpler to apply. So the board decided that they would keep those. We've had some feedback about the tension between bringing in the definition of joint control and retaining the classification, so it might be an area that you want to look at when you're looking at the proposals in the exposure draft. But we do think for SMEs, it will be simpler to apply a single basis for assessing control. And, you know, we really did need to keep those principles aligned. For users, they should have increased comparability and consistency around information. So the question that we have is, do you agree with retaining the three classifications of joint arrangements? Let me just say before, whilst I stop sharing this screen, one of the things we did in the exposure draft was we looked, when we were developing the invitation to comment, quite carefully at the type of questions, because we had already said to people, do you think we should align with this standard? So we didn't want to go back again and said, do you agree with aligning? So we've been a lot more specific in our questions. So an easy one is the conceptual framework. We didn't say, do you think we should align with conceptual framework? Because we'd already said that. What we said was, do you think we've got the balance in the text of that section correct? So let me hand back to you and take any questions that you have.
Well, initially in this question, Michelle, we don't have any comments, and because in principle, the initial comments we got is we agree, and basically this, and perhaps we can, as we progress with the discussions, we can have some other comments for a specific country or other view can be brought. So at the moment, we don't have any disagreement with this view. If someone else wanna comment, we are open. If not, we can continue.
I can see people. Michelle, you are on mute.
Right.
Oh, sorry, I will move on to the revenue section. So for revenue, we are proposing aligning with IFRS 15 and a completely new section in the standard. In the RFI, we were a little bit different on this section. In the RFI, we actually said, do you think we should align with IFRS 15 in full, or do you think we should just do a partial alignment? The views from respondents were quite divided. In the end, we decided if we're going to do it, we may as well do it properly. And we decided, and the board decided that they would do a full alignment. But what we've done in section 23 is we've taken the 5-step model, which is in IFRS 15, and we've rearranged all the requirements that are in the standard and in the application guidance into that 5-step model. And we think that that will make applying section 23 much simpler than, or easy to apply should probably be the correct way of saying it. So we've got this very robust framework. At each step, an SME knows what to do. Then at each step, what we did was we worked with some of our global preparers and asked them where they had challenges in applying IFRS 15. We worked with some of the large audit firms and we worked with some of the medium-sized audit firms to ask for areas of simplification. And in the basis of conclusions to the exposure draft, we list out all of the simplifications that we are proposing to the standard. And there is quite a significant number of simplifications. It includes areas like contract modifications, variable considerations, significant financing components, all the areas where there is a little bit more judgment required. And then the other thing we did, in addition to the simplifications, is we said, well, we'll provide a bit more transition relief. So we'll say to an SME, you can continue with your current revenue recognition project for those contracts that are already in progress. So we do believe that this proposal will give SMEs a really robust and comprehensive framework. We've had pretty good feedback, if I'm honest, on section 23 so far. And we do, although we've put a new framework there, we're thinking that for many SMEs that might just be selling goods or services, there won't really be that much change. Where we'll see a change is that in those SMEs where they have got those more complex contracts. In terms of users, there should be improved comparability and the consistency in the amount of revenue recognised. And we have proposed 1 or 2 improved disclosures. So I could pause there and see if anyone has any comments before we move on to the next section. We haven't included a question here, but I don't know if anyone has any comments on what we're proposing.
Michelle, we don't have any disagreement with this proposed, let's say, alignment with revenue standards. And actually, we welcome it. I think it will represent an improvement and a great guidance for those SMEs and revenue recognition process. So it's the comment that we have at the moment.
Can I actually, I think I have a doubt. The transition relief, which I can apply the current revenue recognition for the contracts that are still in progress, it's going to be a accounting policy choice. Is it? because reading, I was not so sure, so that's why I asked it.
I'll have to have a look. Let me just have a look.
Okay.
Whether it was a choice or whether we required. I think
Yeah.
you're right.
Should be an option, but
Should be an option.
yeah, but it's on
No,
the
it's
top
that-
of my heart. I mean that, but
Okay.
yeah, but let's check. It should be an option because I actually you should be able to apply it.
Yeah, being an option, I don't know if it's clear, and I don't know if it's required to have a disclosure about it. Just because I mean, maybe some SME can have consolidated, can be consolidated in a full IFRS standard company, and it can use this option.
Yeah, so it's paragraph A22 on page 325 of the exposure draft. It does it says you can do either method, so either or. So I think either or is an option.
Okay. Okay, if it's an option, it will be required a disclosure.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Okay. If that's okay, and then I will move on to some of the other topics that we're not making proposals for, but we are seeking some views on. So, so there are two significant topics. One is IFRS 16. In the request for information, we did ask, should we align with IFRS 16? We got very mixed feedback on this. There was quite a lot of concern about the cost and effort to SMEs to apply IFRS 16. And maybe we should wait a little bit longer until IFRS 16 was there was more implementation experience, and particularly from that of the post-implementation review. I think as well, we were quite influenced by investors, because investors were saying when we lend to SMEs, we look at future cash flows. We can't really securitize leased assets. So what's important to us is cash flow information as opposed to having the asset recognized. So the board is asking for views on, if anyone's got any comments. We have heard some people don't support us not aligning with IFRS 16, but we'll see what the overall feedback is. And then the other area the board has set out some proposals in the invitation to comment is around research, the recognition of intangible assets arising from development costs. And we had this feedback in the first comprehensive review that we should allow the costs for development costs to be recognised as intangible assets where they meet the criteria. So there should be consistency with IAS 38. We heard the same arguments, but what we heard in this second comprehensive review was that actually many SMEs now do have the systems in place that would enable them to work out what costs can be recognised as intangible assets, whereas historically we'd heard it's too difficult for SMEs to do this. So the board is asking for people's views on whether they should introduce an accounting policy option for the recognition of intangible assets. Now, I know I've also had the feedback, and I'm sure you guys are going to say it. Well, if you allow the recognition of development costs as intangible assets, you should allow the capitalization of borrowing costs. And I'm sure if we open one of these doors, we're going to end up opening both of them. So let me just stop sharing and see what views people have on those.
It's open for comments. Someone else? Someone want to comment? Bill?
Yeah, my comment there would be with respect to leases in IFRS 16. Michelle, at the pace we're going, the standard will have been in effect for 10 years for full IFRS before it's adopted for SMEs. And I think that's just not, I don't know what the response are going to be. I guess my question to you would be, since I know where you stand, is there even the remotest of possibilities that as a result of the exposure of this standard, you will reconsider the position of not aligning? Is that a possibility even? Maybe it's not.
Well, I think if the board gets, the board always has to consider the feedback as part of its due process.
Sure.
If it's due process, you know, 90% of people come back and say, you should have aligned, then I think it would be, the board would need to think very hard about why they're not aligning. Of course, they could just take leases out altogether, which would have been my preferred option instead of staying in a halfway house. But, you know, don't tell today I said that.
Okay, no, I won't. Thank you.
And another comment we have, Michelle, refers to the capitalization of development costs. I think it's part of your question here. And we are of the view that it should be capitalized. And of course, if, the point on the entity having the ability of controlling it, it matters. Of course, it's a real question, but it's important to say that many small and medium entities that has this kind of activity, they are in a ramp-up process, or it's key for the business of those entities. And so I would be expect to have this control in place, even for strategic reasons. So that's why we are of the view that it should be capitalized. And that's a preliminary view, of course, but it's something that we can comment now.
So if you just one question for you, because actually what we are asking is about introducing an accounting policy choice. And you said that it should be capitalized. It's just because what we thought when we asked that one is that when the current version, we do not allow it because we think it is a simpler process. And then we have this simplification as a principle. The point is that if we require, as you said, I mean, that it's quite important for some entities, might be complicated for others. That's why we thought that an accounting policy should be more welcome than requiring. That's the...
We don't have completed these view, Tadeu. We have some members that believe that as an option is okay, but others believe that as a mandatory policy would be better. So we will, I don't know, we have to complete this discussion probably when the complete set of answers come to the board, and we can deliberate that. But we are discussing. We are discussing it. It's not 100% agreement with the accounting policy choice.
Okay, thank you, sir. I don't see Carlos Valle with his hands on, but I may challenge him because I heard from him in relation to capitalization of borrowing costs. Yes. I don't know whether you want to talk about that, Carlos, please.
Yes, we insist in this point in the documents of GLASS. We think it's necessary for the SMIs you consider the capitalize of borrowing costs, no? For some reasons, no? We explain in other moments. If for the relation between the full IFRS and SMIs for example, for credit lines or the figures shown in the financial statement. No?
Yeah, I think at one point I remember having a conversation with you about that is because of, especially in South America, when we have a very high interest rate, inflation,
Yes.
when you do not capitalize, actually it causes a distortion in relation
Yes.
to the cost. And then it is not just a matter of whether it's simpler or not. It might have more than this impact. And
Yes.
we took note of your comment when you met in WSS, and then it's just to remind that we have this in our radar screen, and it would be
Yes.
important to reinforce this in your comment letter.
Yes, this is very important for condition in South America. It's true. I agree completely with your comment, Tadeu.
Yeah.
And I would say, Tadeu, only completing this point that you raised, it's not only for when we talk about development costs, but borrowing costs too, you know, and that we believe that borrowing costs should be capitalized. When we talk about our interest rates here, which are very high, it can provoke a tremendous distortion in the asset measurement. So that's why we are of the view that borrowing costs should be a capitalization, should have capitalization as a practice and in this point. And development costs, of course, that, as I said before.
Okay, Adriana?
Okay.
It's the same topic. I have a trick question. Everybody said what I was thinking about it, and I've heard it actually, because it's very important when you have a credit line in or else in Latin America, consider the high rates of borrowing rates. It's very important, at least to be an accounting policy choice. But my question is a trick question, because is there any, I've heard some podcasts and I read some documents, is there any possibility of the board to think about this, or in addition, have the board talk about this for SME or the group that is studying the SME chains? About having the borrowing costs capitalized?
I think I said to Carlo when we met him that one, the board's due process will require them to evaluate any feedback that they get. But secondly, I think the feedback would be really useful if it said, look, here's the effect of loan interest in Latin America, where we've got high interest rates. And, we had a worked example. Because I think, if I'm honest, for us, although we might get a bit more used to it going forward, we've been used to a very low interest rate environment. So we wouldn't place the same level of emphasis on the problem as maybe you do. And although, I always know when we're sat at the table and we're talking about something, because the board members from higher interest rate economies have a different view. So I think something that sets out an example that the other board members that come from Europe, where there's been low interest rates for well over a decade, that it would be useful for them to actually see the impact, because otherwise they're just kind of hearing the same argument. But something that's more specific that says, hey guys, if they've been allowed to capitalize the borrowing costs on this capital contract that they were doing, I think that would be useful.
Yeah, and if I can just add to your comment, Michelle, is that we have to avoid, for example, because these both subjects, just to both matters, development costs and borrowing costs, when we put an accounting policy choice, it looks like that, okay, you can apply the full IFRS if you want. It's just to avoid having accounting policy choice in all sections. For every single section, you can apply for it. That's not what we are looking for. For these two specific subjects, is slightly different. We have a good reason to stop and think whether it makes sense to apply. And why accounting policy choice? Because within IFRS for SME, we have a so wide range of different entities that might be more relevant for ones than the others. That's why it would be so important for us if in the comment letters you can make your point about, I think that should be for everybody, for just for some, in which case, the more detail that you can provide us, the better for us to assess and make a decision.
Is it useful to include example with numbers?
Yeah, could do
Okay.
that, definitely.
Okay, good. Just to let everybody know and to.
We love numbers.
I love
Okay.
it. Okay, thank you.
We are
Noted. And mainly the way the numbers are built, it's important. All right, noted. We can continue if you don't have any more comments. All right.
You are on mute, Michelle.
So in the final slides, I was outlining that the invitation to the exposure draft is open until March, and then we will go back through a period of redeliberations. Well, I mean, that's March 2023. I think it will be at least 2024 before we see a standard. I mean, most will depend on the level of feedback we get. And then I would encourage you, on our website, there are a number of resources available, and we will be publishing next Monday a short video that just introduces the exposure draft. Then after that, we will be publishing the longer presentation that we gave at World Standard Setters. And then the week after that, we will publish our SME quarterly update. So there is a lot of supporting material. I'm just going to check with my two colleagues from the SME team who joined me today whether I've said anything wrong or there's anything they would like to add. So Taniko and Michelle, is there anything that you would like to add or correct?
I'd probably only say on the expected credit losses, the board did consider the cost benefits quite extensively, and this is described in the basis for conclusions, so it'd be worth having a look at the basis for conclusions for those discussions. And we have also issued an update newsletter which explains how we've dealt with feedback from users of financial statements in the proposals in the exposure draft. We'll be highlighting that newsletter in the newsletter we issued in 2 weeks' time. We'll provide a link to that newsletter.
Yeah, it's just to some people might not be aware, Michelle, but we have is it a monthly newsletter for the SME, isn't it?
It's a quarterly.
Quarterly. Okay. Okay, it is available as well in our website. And if I can also add one point in relation to, especially to the last part of the presentation, talking about issues that we are not aligned or asking you whether we should. One of the first slides that Michelle presented is in relation to when we had the reviews. We have the first edition of IFRS for SMEs in 2009. The second edition was entered into force in 2017, 8 years after. It means that anything that we don't decide now probably will take some years before it can come back to the agenda. It's just to let people know that what we decide now is different from, for example, IFRS full, that we have this kind of maintenance, narrow scope amendments. For IFRS for SME, and this is very welcome. We have this stable platform. That's the good size. The good news is that this is a stable platform. The bad news is that for every change, it takes years until it comes into force. Therefore, when we discuss, especially these three last items that we discussed, just think about that. And don't tell Michelle that I said that.
All right. We will keep it as secret as possible.
Please do.
But nevertheless, our general perception is that this project brings a tremendous improvements and in terms of financial statement preparation for SMEs. But on the other hand, we will require tremendous educational effort because it will be aligned with the full IFRS as much as possible. And so the gap between those two type of entities, I think, will be shortened. And but I think it's a good news because we are looking for quality. It's important to remember, Tadeu, that in our region we have countries in different levels of adoption of SMEs, and this change, of course, will offer a platform for continuous modification in the local legislation of certain countries. So in general, I think that this project is very, very welcome. And we are working on it because it's a long document. And we hope that we can promote a second outreach in the future, whereas we can have a progressive more with our work. And I think we could bring more views on how we are working on it.
Okay. Thank you, Jose. Just one in relation to one of your comments that you made. And as I said, and to remind people, we have very good training modules in our website on IFRS for SME. And I think that is worth thinking about having this available, translated into Spanish and Portuguese. And I think that this is something that we could work and think about, because it could be very important for the region when we have all this material. It's a very rich one, very helpful one, available to everybody. I think that we should think a kind of joint arrangement for us to have this documentation available for everybody in Spanish and in Portuguese.
Right. Yeah, and at glance, we are deploying, let's say, educational material too very soon, and I think we can, in the future, close cooperation with IASB on this point too, and because it will benefit our public here in general, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if we have anything else left to present. I think it was over, no, Michelle or Tadeu, for today.
Yeah. No, we don't have anything else to present. Well, I'd like to apologize for sounding so croaky and coughing through the presentation. That's why I've been expelled to my home and not allowed in the office until I've recovered. So.
All right. No, we appreciate it very much. You posed very significant questions for us. And we have other miscellaneous questions that we have here. I think it will be better we can discuss it in the next presentation. And we are consolidating everything we are collecting from the different areas. And I think it will be a very, very good exercise putting all together, no?
Right. No, it would be really helpful. And thank you for the helpful and constructive feedback today. Thank you.
Right. And I don't know if someone else here have any comments, complete comments? All right. So Tadeu, I will revert to you for your final comments.
Again, just to thank you all for your time, investing time to read the documents, prepare the comments for this outreach. It was very good experience. As I said before, we got a lot of comment letters from the region. I was very proud of that. And I think that we do need to do that, because we are the region with most country jurisdiction applying IFRS for SME, and we should provide good level of feedback to the IASB. And then therefore, again, I thank you for the comment letters, and I'm expecting to thank you again.
All right, Tadeu, we thank you and all the team that is here with us today. It is very, very valuable for our people here that is here, the board and from the task force that are with us, Carlos Valle, who is the advisory at the IASB, and we will be very, very happy to continue discussing it here and commenting due course. So thank you all for this opportunity, and we see you soon. Bye.